Hello and welcome back to our podcast. Today we will be covering art and its intersection not only with geopolitics but also the local developments in the Arctic. And to cover this topic we have an expert on this, we could say, Ekaterina Sharova, art historian, educator and curator at the Arctic Art Forum, as well as PhD candidate at the University of Lapland. It's great to have you. The Arctic Art Forum has been going on for quite some time now. It's a 10-year anniversary, you could say, this time. And its first topic was embodied knowledge in 2016. Now it's climate micro changes. There has been many changes happening in the world and in the Arctic specifically for the past 10 years. How has this affected the conversations happening in the art world or the art forum, so to speak?
When we started in 2016, we had a group of several curators and artists who just saw the necessity of rediscovering our own heritage and history. So I'm born and raised in Arkhangelsk in the north of Russia and moved to Norway in 2004. To study literature and stories, who tells the stories, how they are shared, how they are communicated are very interesting questions for me. So in 2016, we saw many digital images, archival images being digitized, many stories, those who disappear, stories about indigenous people, stories about the North. For example, the story of the Northern Railway. In Russia, and a story of New Arkhangelsk, the first capital of Alaska, which was not familiar to the people in Arkhangelsk for many decades, became familiar. So all these stories became visible thanks to social networks, internet, and this could be very interesting material. At the same time, we saw ongoing security challenges. I was working on the border after my graduation as in history of art. I studied at the University of Oslo, got my master's there, studying Norwegian history of art, including Erik Barents, who is around us here today. But I have never learned anything about the Sami art and art from the north in general. And it was not for such a long time ago, just like 14 years ago, and I found it very interesting why some stories they are in the history of art and some stories are not there. So after graduation, I was working in Kirkenes on the border between Russia, Norway and Finland, which is a very charged area and interesting area in terms of indigenous heritage, but also because of this spending tensions between different countries. And you understand very quickly what you're actually doing up there when you organize conversations between different artists, invite politicians, architects, designers. You realize the role of culture, which is completely different up there than anywhere else. And then we realized that it's important to start talking about forgotten stories of our ancestors. Because I have a kind of mixed background myself. I have both Finno-Ugric background and Pomor background, but this local knowledge has disappeared. And many families, they just didn't know their own stories, their own histories, since most of the knowledge you got in school at university is about military success of the country and so on, and not that much about the local stories, which actually can also have national importance, like the first capital of Alaska, all the story of the colonization of Alaska, where people from Arkhangelsk area took a very important part, just disappeared. This lack of knowledge was a kind of a starting point. At the same time, you could see for the last 10 years that the climate is also something is happening, and that's why we choose this topic today. Everything we have been talking about just grew from the experience. You just see what happens and you just decide, okay, this could be a relevant topic. At the same time, you see that the artists, they produce something. Artists working in the Arctic, born and raised in the Arctic, but also those who travel and work there, they constantly produce something new, and this also needed a platform. So that was the initial idea, just to create this platform, because there were not so many of them.
And it's fantastic to hear this as an example of how art operates in this intersection, or you could say in society, amidst many changes. So I guess my question to you then is, this art form, you've been sustaining dialogue, a pan-Arctic dialogue, for a long time. And what role would you say that maybe not only art in itself, but conversations we have about art and local, indigenous, or any kinds of this related types of art, which role does this have in the current, not really geopolitics either, it's just in local development, you could say also?
Well, after I moved to the north in 2014, I just and worked at Barents Spectacle, and then started Arctic Art Forum, taking part in creating the first festival in Tiriberka village in the north. I was also working with various projects in Finland, co-curating the first exhibition at the Arctic Art Summit. You see that many artists and cultural researchers in the north, they have similar challenges. Like when you meet musicians from the northern Canada, it echoes challenges people from other places had. You hear about decisions that are being made in the centers, and people who, like, knowledge in the centers is not necessarily taken into consideration the knowledge from the north. For example, when I was at the Arctic Frontiers conference in Tromsø, we had a seminar there with the University of Lapland and participants from museums. And in the dinner break, there was a conversation with a master, like newly educated master students from the University of Oslo, master in the Russian studies. And I was very inspired by all my discoveries, because I'm like a researcher. I'm like, wow, there's so much information. I'm going to research, I'm going to work with it. And so I was talking about like Pomor, trade, New Alaska, and all this like interconnectedness in the north. And she didn't really recognize my story about the Pomor trade, which was actually the precedent, the case when Northern Norway and Northern Russia actually traded together, because it was a very practical way of communicating without someone interfering from the capitals, because people living in the north, they just want to live their lives, they want to survive in this climate, and selling fish or changing fish for like goods from Russia, for example. And then this trade was very important for the Barents collaboration, which was established after the 1993, after Kirkenes Declaration was signed. And this was an initiative of Thorvald Stoltenberg. Still today, you have, today after the Barents collaboration is basically over, after 3 decades, you see that the fruits are still there. They're not necessarily visible. They're not necessarily communicated well, but you see that they are still there. I'm interested in communicating this. And one of the participants at forum this year was an activist who is now also a sound artist, who has been active with environmental movements here in Norway, and now she works as an artist. So her sound work was recorded in the town of Apatite in the Kola Peninsula, and it was called Concert for the Plants. So we chose to place it in the middle of the botanical garden. So this like sad in a way, or like contemplation about the environmental challenges today, it was moved in a way from the north, from the area where you're trying to survive in this suffocate, like in the environments where both creative people and plants, they suffocated. I think it was rather strong, but I think it's important to in terms of knowledge, because when you work with research about a certain area without the possibility to travel there, how can you actually create knowledge? If you work with text or with press is one thing, but I think it's important to have a contact with people who are in certain areas to create knowledge. So in this from this epistemological viewpoint, I think it's essential to keep the conversation going with those people who actually have critical abilities, and contemporary artists and cultural researchers are one of them.
And one thing about this story, or one thing about this concept for plants, I think is fascinating, is how we, as an audience at least, see these stories about climate change being portrayed in maybe non-conventional ways. And this is what you've been working with also, this intersection of how do we tell these stories about the climatic changes and the intersection between stories and climate. So I guess then what I want to ask is that then how do the stories that we tell or that we hear, how do they affect us and how do we affect them in this space, as you have seen?
Well, I think it's, for me, it's connected with, or at least I have realized it until today, that the stories and storytelling is connected to the question of power, of course. And when you are a grassroots activist or when you're a contemporary artist in a place where there's basically no space for critical voices, it's just disappears. But once you have a place where you can actually have support for your message, where you have people who make like science-based or knowledge-based decisions, like for example the Climate House, you really can create a space for these voices, which have not been that heard or listened to for a while. I think it's super important that you have these spaces. We had many works which we didn't show, especially, for example, from Alaska. And another story is, which I found very relevant, especially for the topic of embodied knowledge. If you go back, like 10 years back, there was a film of Katie Basil from Alaska. And in her film, young kids in the village of Napakiak ask elders, like, okay, where did you like to play? Where were your favorite places here? Where did you like hide here? And the elders in this area, they just tell their stories. And at the same time, Katie, she collaborated with the kids to take like drone footage. So they have many pictures and then they just draw on this footage. And you see that basically the area where these elders played when they were young kids, it's now covered by water. And it's, we have so many stories. And for example, we have similar story in the area of Pertaminsk in Arkhangelsk region. We didn't show it because we have that very small space, and hopefully we'll have more possibilities to have like bigger spaces. But you have many similar stories all around the Arctic region, and I think it's very important. And Katie, she's really brilliant in terms that she shares these stories with the world. She chooses to live there. She chooses to be there and tell these stories, share them.
But the current art forum about climate micro changes, why micro changes? Do you want to explain the concept of it?
I think that the climate change is a very difficult topic. You have to see, for me, it took 15 years to realize it, because I remember I have friends who work together with Natura Ungdom here. And I remember this conversation, I think 2008, when I was on my bachelor's here, and I was meeting them and we were going to Frogner Park, and I was very much into education, and I was on my way to India doing something with kids there, and I was very much about that. And I remember that I think it was very far away for me in 2008. I didn't find it very important. And you just realize you have to be like mature enough to realize what it is all about. And I found it very inspiring to see how the climate houses, they work with education, because the very space is about educating young people about the climate change. And they start with like 3-year-old kids when they just, construct a cloud with them. They do some water exercises with the small kids, because it's very huge and complicated challenge, which is about every person on this planet. But at the same time, when you think about the North, you see that the Arctic gets warmer 4 times quicker than the rest of the world, and it happens very quickly. And if you look, you don't really have like huge New York-like cities in the Arctic. You have small villages like Napakiak, like Pertaminsk, Murmansk maybe is a bigger town, but you have small villages, and in each of these villages, you have some small challenges registered, be it in Alaska or be it in Chukotka. But I mean, if you see them, it's maybe not that interesting. But when you see them connected, you realize that the global challenge is happening. And I think it was important to have this symposium because we organize symposiums where we have these meetings place between researchers. And this year, researchers and artists. And this year we had a researcher from Meteorological Institute, Kjetil Isaksen, who started he was sharing his story because he also has a story. If you go back to literature, because he started in the 90s, he started his research on Svalbard in the 90s, and he has observed how the situation changed. And 2022, 2024, maybe the most extreme on Svalbard. We also had an artist who grew up on Svalbard. It's not a big city. Longyearbyen is a small place. And we met with him actually in 2001 when I traveled to Svalbard with my family, just on vacation. And he was not exhibited then at the autumn exhibition. We had very interesting conversations with him. And being a performance artist on Svalbard, doing this choice was interesting in itself. So we showed at the forum, 3 of his works, and it's a kind of small story. It's one person. It's a small town, Longyearbyen, but when he stands on the piece of ice and when he destroys it, the first reaction is a kind of a confusion, or some people start to laugh. But then you start to understand that the artist refers to our lack of understanding that we are actually, it's us who are responsible for what happens. And you have many of these stories. You have many artists who are trying to talk about the same topics, pointing out the challenges, but also talking about the solutions, or at least the directions where we can move, raising awareness and creating spaces for some sustainable solutions. On pedagogy is probably one of them. And I know that not many people from contemporary art would be interested. Some of them, they don't want to have any pedagogy or any agency. Art should be free, but it can be discussed.
And speaking of, you mentioned that this is something about us also being responsible and also being part of this, we could say, huge destructive system towards the climate and the environment around us. One thing that is also fascinating about this is the value that people and the agency that people have. And this is kind of what you've been showing for many years now, the people-to-people cooperation, the value in people-to-people work. But I can imagine it has not really become easier. It has only become more difficult. So my question to you is, what is your experience with this people-to-people level of collaborating in art, but also in your maybe scientific work as well?
Well, this
big question.
I think it's very personal question for me, because I would never end up in Norway if Thorvald Stoltenberg had ever initiated this collaboration, which I believed was a brilliant idea, and I'm sure that it was a fantastic idea. Because when I was working with the first forums in Arkhangelsk, which is my hometown, discovering all these histories and being fascinated by as an art historian, you just are fascinated. Wow, there's so many stories which are not told. I want to tell the stories. And at the same time, we could consider many various collaborations, for example, with China. But it could be possible if you are a theater or if you are a big museum and you want to collaborate with a big museum in China, and the director of this museum meets the director of that museum. So it's completely different situation in the Barents collaboration, where an artist from north of Norway can initiate a project with an institution or an artist in the north of Russia. Completely different level. It was not something official. It was about friendships. And for many, I think it was also a way just to be able to create art, because there are not so many supporting systems in the north. I remember when we started, compared ourselves, it was me and 3 other young curators. We compared ourselves and all these young artists which were trying to help them. Well, with a plant which is trying to grow on a stone, because if you don't have any food, the critical voices will not be able to grow. But thanks to the people-to-people collaboration and these possibilities that Barents collaboration gave both to young artists in the north of Norway, but also in the north of Russia, I think it gave the space to critical voices. But at the same time, I have been following various discussions in Nordnorsk, many different conversations in the north, mostly by men. Barents, International Barents Observer, which I find very patriarchal voice. It's mostly about military, it's mostly about security, but you have also other stories. You have stories of women, you have stories of young, vulnerable artists who are just trying to survive. And for us, it was important to give them at least some possibilities for expression. And thanks to this people-to-people contacts, it was possible for a while. And we don't know how to continue, but I think it's important to sustain the platform for free speech, basically.
You mentioned this hard security, patriarchal debates that have been increasing in many ways unfortunately, around the Arctic now. And one thing I was thinking about is that when looking up either Arctic Art Forum or the Arctic Art Institute, both show up with an eco-feminist perspective. I personally love this as a very hard feminist myself, but I'm wondering what are the implications of this? How do you project this eco-feminist perspective into this world?
Well, when I just graduated as an art historian in 2012, and in 2012, I was volunteering at the Oslo World Festival, and I met an artist who was a part of a feminist collective in Moscow. My very first project as a curator was connected to, you can say, Western feminist tradition with Judith Butler, Rosie Braidotti, and Russian feminist artists. And then I realized that there is a perspective that completely disappears in this story, like, for example, my perspective of a person from the north. And I thought that it's important to talk about it. And my father, he was a philosopher and eco-activist who was fighting for the rights of the people living on the shore of the White Sea when the diamond company came there and wanted to basically have everything, regardless of people who live there and their lives. And I think that it's what I realized after having graduated, that the world is male-dominated. The stories in the north are male-dominated. Luckily, I ended up at Kirkenes, and women in the north on the bridge. But you also have many people, I will not say name, but who are not interested in culture. They are not covering the culture. If we talk in general, culture and art, they are being cut both in Aftenposten and all this Dagblad, all this newspaper. If you talk about contemporary art, which is especially here, and also maybe you have some people, you have art critics who studied together with me, all these guys. But when you go to the north, you just don't have the field. You have maybe Soviet journalists who used to write about theater. But what you're trying to do, we are trying to find the ways how to communicate it. We are talking about crafts, this and that, and traditions. But I think it's important with this multiplicity of perspectives on the one hand. On another hand, I remember there was some festival in Oslo, and there was a conversation between football team from Kirkenes and a researcher about Russia. I don't think she knew that anyone from Russia sat in the audience, but I remember this conversation, and I remember when I came to start some artistic projects in the north after my work at Kirkenes, and I just remember this enthusiasm of the locals when I'm coming. Okay, I want to do art projects. Some people, more conservative ones, they looked at you like crazy. Like, what are you doing? Why you don't do a job and earn money and buy yourself a house? But some people, they were, yes, people from culture. Because people from culture, people from art, they speak one language. Whatever you are, you speak the same language. You speak the language of this sensitivity to colors, to aesthetics. Alexander Baumgarten, he created this discipline as a opposite to this rationality. And I think it's important to have this sensitivity, to have this femininity on the agenda, because it's not only about the weapon. Free speech is also very powerful, and there's also a reason why states and certain decision makers, they choose to cover this. I just remember how I was telling this story, how I came to Russia, and everyone was just opening the door, because many people couldn't just believe that someone is actually coming back there, even the people working with culture, because everyone just leaves. You don't have any possibilities. But for me, I consider it as a field work also, but I think it's important to have a space for these stories. And it's not so many of them, because even when you look at the Arctic studies all around, you don't have much coverage of art and culture in the media in general. It's mostly personal interests of people. So the overall dominated stories are stories of men. It was like that for 100 years ago, and it still continues today.
Absolutely, it does. Let's create an experiment. Let's say you can go to either to the Norwegian Storting or whichever government you like, and you have the ability to make, let's say, any change you want in how art and the art world, in the Arctic specific art world, is perceived or funded or supported, whatever you want. You have all the power for one day. What is the first thing that you do?
Well, I think if we talk about this specific region, I think it's really important to have opportunities for young people. I believe in the power of culture. It changes lives of people. I saw with my own eyes when you, as a person with a degree, when you come into certain places and allow people to play with you, like, okay, you can just join our festival. They join it. I think art and culture has this special power, but I would create possibilities for young people, because many people in the north, and especially in the Russian north now, they don't have these possibilities. I have seen many people in depression. I have seen many people who left. I've seen many people with degrees who chose to just earn money through some random jobs, because they just didn't believe in the art anymore, even they had a degree from goldsmiths. And I think contribution to this infrastructure, it's about infrastructure, basically, that young people, they have chances. I think it's really, really important.
Thank you. I hope that somebody does this, but we'll have to see. Always important to hope. Thank you so much for a lovely conversation, for great insights. It's been great to listen to you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening.